I'd like to welcome everyone to this COVID-19 Therapeutics Whirlwind webinar. My name is Jason Roberts. I'm from the University of Queensland and the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital. A pleasure to convene this webinar for you. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of activities related to COVID, although being in Australia, we've been very fortunate with the low caseload that we have had compared to other parts of the world. But that being said, as part of the due diligence and the being very prudent with our approach to there being such a severe pandemic worldwide, there's been a lot of activity going on in Australia in preparation for should we be put into a situation whereby we have to deal with it in the same way that other parts of the world have had to. So as part of this, I've had my own personal significant interest in following the development of all the different therapeutic options and the discussions that there had been, the early hypotheses about repurposing of some agents and how successful they may be, to the stage now whereby 14 to 15 months on from when the pandemic first began, we've learned so much and there has been so much data that has emerged. And so it really is time, I think, for us to try and summarize a lot of that. And so I think that we're very fortunate to have the speakers that we have for this webinar. We've got speakers from multiple countries, multiple continents, people that are leading major studies around the world, people that have completed major studies and are published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It really is an all-star cast of fantastic clinicians and researchers from a multidisciplinary background. And so it really is my pleasure to be able to introduce them throughout the course of the evening and to really facilitate this most interesting webinar as experts distill down all of the available information on the different topics into something which I hope will be very useful to each of you in your practice and your knowledge about how to best treat these patients who have COVID-19 disease. First presenter is Associate Professor Stephen Tong from the Doherty Institute in Melbourne, Australia, and he also works at the Royal Melbourne Hospital as an infectious diseases physician. Now, I've been very fortunate enough to get to know Steve relatively well over the last 12 months, as he is the one of the lead, or the PI, the principal investigator for the ASCOT ADAPT study, which is a multinational trial looking at different therapies for treatment of COVID-19 disease for patients that are hospitalised. And Steve is going to discuss this in a lot of detail in his 15 to 20 minute presentation today. So I'd like to welcome Steve. It's been wonderful being able to work with him and learn from him as he's put together this wonderful trial. And there's certainly been some wonderful and interesting learnings that we've both had over the course of over the last 14 months, which I know that he'll share with you. So, Stephen, thank you.
Thanks very much, Jason. I appreciate you inviting me to speak at this august forum. And it's been, as you've mentioned, it's been great working with you and your team as well over this past 12 months or so. Let me share my screen. So before I start, let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet upon and pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and elders past, present and emerging. So as Jason mentioned, I'm the lead PI for the ASCOT study, and I'm going to speak not so much about the results that we found or that other studies have found, but really the lessons that we've learned from trying, and I'm kind of stressing the word trying, to run a clinical trial during a pandemic. And this will be really more specific to our Australian context, Australian New Zealand context, where we've been trying to do this study. So as mentioned, my conflicts of interest on lead PI for the ASCOT study. So this is a graph of the two waves really that have occurred in Australia leading up to about mid-November here. So again, we first saw cases from about the 24th or the 25th of January. And the first wave was across Australia and was really mainly in return travellers. And then the second wave started towards the end of June. And this was really centred on Melbourne, where we had a lot of community transmission. We peaked at about 700 cases, new cases per day during mid to late July. And so our hospital system, similar to the hospital systems around the world, became reasonably stressed during that period in Melbourne. It was during the, I guess, early phase of all this, when February, March, when I gathered with some colleagues and said, we really should run a clinical trial. We don't know where this pandemic is going to go. We need to be ready for that. We would like to have equitable access to novel therapeutics for patients in Australia. And we just need to be prepared for that, prepared for the fact that we don't know what's going to happen. And so we started the ASCOT study, and the first two therapies that we were interested in were hydroxychloroquine and lopinavir/ritonavir. And there was pretty reasonable, I guess, basic laboratory data to suggest that repurposing these two drugs may offer benefit to patients, but it really needed to be trialled in clinical trials around the world before these should be used as standard therapy. And so by the time we actually got the trial up and running, you can see that we really got into the end of that first peak in Australia. And so in some ways, we'd missed that initial boat. During that kind of fairly fallow period in April through to June, lots of things happened around the world, of course. There were a lot of cases in the UK and the United States and many other countries, including Italy and Spain. And we started learning about things that may or may not work. So remdesivir was shown to reduce the time to clinical improvement. And this was published in the New England in May. The recovery trial had gotten up and running, and they found that dexamethasone had a very significant impact on mortality, and particularly for patients who are on ventilators. But they also found that hydroxychloroquine didn't work, and that lopinavir/ritonavir didn't work. And this was amongst thousands of patients who were randomized to either one of these agents or to control, so no antiviral. And so that meant that there were major implications for our study, and that the biggest trial that was happening in the world found that the two agents that we had weren't going to work. And this had obviously implications for our study sites and the equipoise for whether our hospital sites were willing to randomise patients to these therapies. And so just as the second wave started in Australia, or in Melbourne, we ended up closing hydroxychloroquine and lopinavir/ritonavir. As you can see, there was about a month's delay from the announcements in recovery to us making that decision to do so. And we very quickly pivoted to opening a convalescent plasma arm or domain, and worked closely with Zoe McQuilton and the Red Cross Blood Bank in Australia to make this possible. So we opened for convalescent plasma at that point in time, and we gradually recruited some patients over the rest of that I guess second wave. Things kept happening. We wanted to make our trial more adaptable, and we brought in additional arms. We wanted to test interferon as well, and nifamostat, a novel antiviral agent. We were pretty excited with the interferon and had talked to the company about obtaining drug supplies. But then the WHO Solidarity trial was published, or at least their results were released, showing that, again, hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir/ritonavir, remdesivir, but in particular in this case interferon, also were not effective. And so again, we crossed interferon out, having done quite a lot of work to try and bring that on board. And subsequently, moving further forward in time now, the recovery trial had a big press release, about 10,000 patients, suggesting that convalescent plasma was not effective, had no clinical benefit. And so we've now closed that down as well. So you can see we've kind of almost run 4 or 5 different trials, except we've managed to get very few patients into the study for each of these different agents. So it's been a very, very challenging trial to try to conduct. So these were the trial sites that we've had open at various times across, most of the eastern seaboard and some in other states and territories as well in Australia. We've included patients in New Zealand as well. And of course, one of the main things, as we've noted, the pandemic was fluctuating in Australia. We've had very few numbers, was the importance of thinking about going overseas. And so we approached the George Institute, must be kind of May, June, now in 2020, about trying to find sites in India. And we've just very recently opened a couple of sites in India. So that's taken some time, but the amazing kind of hard work of people from the George Institute, including Professor Venkatesh, has made that possible. So one of the challenging things as well has been, I guess, the unpredictability of where patients have turned up. So this is Melbourne during the peak of that second wave. And we had, certain hospitals that we thought these are the major public hospitals where patients will be turning up. And these are the ones in red, and they're in red on that table there, as well as red dots, which represent the size of patients who were in those hospitals at that time. So we had some of these covered, and we could recruit from these hospitals in red, which were open at the time. There were quite a few hospitals, which were largish hospitals, which we had in our sites, but weren't quite open at the time. But there were a whole bunch of other hospitals as well, many of these smaller private hospitals, which we just really didn't consider as being a priority for getting up and running as sites, who actually had probably 50% of the patients who presented to our hospital systems. And in many of these cases, they were hospitals which were looking after nursing home patients who almost en masse went to one of these hospitals. And I guess that was one of the other things that made it hard to recruit, was that many of these patients were nursing home patients where really, active therapies weren't necessarily in the best interest of that patient. And so being randomized and enrolled in a clinical trial also was judged as not being in the best interests of these elderly patients. The trial governance, I'll just give you a brief kind of idea of it's been a lot of people involved. So you can see many, many committees. Most of these committees are probably 8 to 10 people. The International Trial Steering Committee has been meeting almost weekly for the last 9 to 10 months. So it's been an amazing amount of energy and time commitment from a whole number of people around Australia and around the world. And I guess that's one of the things I've learned, is that people have been really energetic and willing to pitch in to helping to conduct such a study. And I think, when you think about this, is one trial out of many around the world, around Australia, and the amount of energy and effort that's gone into each of these trials is probably similar. So amazing effort in that regard. Some of the lessons that as I've reflected about this, that I think we can learn from, is that things have been a bit too slow in Australia. Particularly funding wise, in terms of national funding. The first big national call for funding through the Medical Research Futures Fund, the MRFF, occurred in March 23, and this was awarded on June the 2nd. As you can imagine, June the 2nd we were almost towards, right smack bang towards the start of that second wave, and we had certainly passed that very first wave. This was really too late. When you think about a clinical trial, you don't get that up and running once you get the funding. It still takes a long lead up period to actually getting patients into a trial. So this all took a long time. Philanthropy did step in here and was much more rapid in being able to provide substantial funding to trials like ASCOT, and we were very fortunate to be beneficiaries of that. Governance approvals for each hospital have been too slow as well, and in many cases very variable. So sometimes it might take 48 hours to obtain those approvals. In other cases, it will take months. And what each individual hospital, the way it's set up in Australia, is each individual hospital needs to give approval for the conduct of a trial. There's no kind of centralized, streamlined approach. And so the diversity of questions that get asked, of demands that are made, of the time that takes, I think has been really detrimental to us being able to get many trial sites up and running quickly. This is, I guess, exemplifies the difficulty. So I kind of thought, with ASCOT, we've recruited 33 patients over this time. And I kind of thought, have we been an outlier? Have we just really struggled and everyone else has done reasonably well? The answer is probably no. I think we're just similar to everyone else. Everyone has struggled in Australia. So of the studies that have been funded through the MRFF, I've listed most of them here. The ones in this grey are those which are through the MRFF respiratory trials grant. That was the one I've described. And you can see of the 7 studies that were funded through that, the actual number of patients that have been recruited have been not very large. In fact, the number of patients actually with COVID who've been into these trials probably numbers less than 5 across all of Australia. The ones which I have in question marks, I've emailed the chief investigators but haven't heard back from them. Obviously, the couple of the success stories have been Remap Cap, which has been a platform for ICU patients. They've recruited over 5,000 patients. Very few of those would have been in Australia, but they've had over 200 sites around the world. And I guess that's another lesson for during a pandemic. You can't really chase the patients. You've got to be prepared with sites all around the world if possible. And certainly they've benefited from involving the United Kingdom and the National Institutes for Health Research there in recruiting the majority of their patients. And then there's been the Virco study, which is one of favipiravir for mainly outpatients led by James McMahon at the Alfred Hospital, and they've managed to recruit 97 patients. So that's been a bit of a success story as well, compared to, I guess, where the majority of studies have landed. You could argue that we've had too many studies in Australia and New Zealand. When we look at the trial registry, the ANZ CTR and look up COVID-19 treatment and interventional trials, there's 56 of them. And given the patient numbers, that's obviously meant we've been competing for many of the same patients. It's also meant a duplication of the infrastructure. You've seen the infrastructure for ASCOT, that's probably been duplicated, across many studies. And this then also relates to a burden of patients who may end up being approached for multiple different studies. I think we've had too little existing infrastructure, and it's been very difficult to rapidly build capacity, particularly during a pandemic when hospitals and the clinical services are stressed. Without dedicated research capacity, it makes it very difficult to recruit patients well. And I think as a general principle, it's too onerous to get into clinical trials. And the question of why is randomized care actually harder to do than random care? It shouldn't be that way, but in fact it is. It's much harder to randomize patients, collect the data properly, work out safety and outcomes in a prospective manner. It's much harder to do that than it is to ad hoc prescribe hydroxychloroquine or convalescent plasma or whatever it might be. And I think we just need to shift that kind of paradigm a bit. So some of my recommendations would be that, next time round, we should really think about more rapidly mobilizing government funding. Maybe it means getting, competing groups together to say, look, you've just got to work together and we'll fund a whole group of you together and you can work out how to get that funding across. And the prize consortia has had some kind of role in doing that. I just think we've got to streamline governance processes and approvals. And I know that's a very difficult process because each individual hospital is its own legal entity. So this is way above my pay grade, but what we've seen in this pandemic has been way too hard. And it may need the involvement of our chief health officers across both federal and state levels. I think it'd be ideal if we coordinated our platforms and prioritized different studies in a better way rather than have all these different competing studies. And we need to establish better infrastructure, really, that is there during both peacetime, but then can then be rapidly pivoted during a pandemic to more rapidly upscale. And I guess this is not just true for COVID again, but it'd be great if we could better embed and normalise clinical research in Australia. So my last few slides are really to reflect on one of the big success stories in clinical trials globally, and that's been the recovery trial, which has been conducted in the United Kingdom. Martin Landray is the principal investigator for recovery, and they've just incredibly recruited over 35,000 patients now into this study across 177 hospitals in the United Kingdom. And so Martin's been tweeting every now and then about their recruitment rates, and you can see between the 7th of January and the 20th of January, they recruited 5,000 patients. So that means what's that, 13 days for 5,000 patients. So less than 3 days per 1,000 patients. So remarkable recruitment rates. There are now up to 37,458 patients. I guess to put that into context, and we can beat ourselves around the head, that of course means that they've had a lot of overall cases in the United Kingdom. That's 37,000 in a clinical trial, and a single clinical trial is almost double the total number of cases we've had in Australia for the whole past 12 months. So they've looked at multiple, different agents. Many of these have been shown not to work, and I think that's just as important as showing things that do work. But they have shown that dexamethasone and tocilizumab, and we'll hear more about both of those in further talks, at least in recovery, that they were beneficial. And now they've gone on to continue to look at colchicine, Regeneron monoclonal antibodies, aspirin, and baricitinib. So what's made recovery work well? Well, I think one thing's just been that, really high level support. So all the chief medical officers of all the parts of the United Kingdom wrote a letter to every single NHS hospital and said, these are the 3 trials, these are 3 national trials that you guys should participate in. So that was Principle, which was a primary care trial, Recovery, which was for ward and ICU patients, and also REMAP-CAP for critically ill patients. And you must prioritize getting patients into these studies. And I think that kind of idea from Doug Altman that rather than multiplicity of studies, it's better if we do less research that's better and that's been done well and for the right reasons. And what's of course helped is that they've had this NIHR clinical research network that's already existing. They have these local clinical research networks with clinical trials units associated with those. And at each individual hospital site or within each of these networks, there is funded capacity to conduct clinical trials. And the way that I understand it is that investigators can then apply to this network to say, we would like to conduct such and such a study on diabetes or on ischemic heart disease or whatever it might be. And then they prioritize which of those studies to put through this network. And so over 2019 to 2020, they recruited over 700,000 participants in clinical research studies. They're not all randomized controlled trials, but in clinical research studies through this network, which is the equivalent of getting over 2,000 patients into studies that are nationally coordinated every single day. And of course, once COVID hit, that took priority. They decided to prioritize that over other research, and studies like Recovery were able to take advantage of that kind of network which already existed with its existing capacity, and were able to basically mandate to all these study sites get involved in these studies, and were therefore able to rapidly recruit and rapidly answer all these questions which have been so helpful for everyone else around the world. Before I go on with just that slide, I'd just like to acknowledge Meg Jardine, Dr. Meg Jardine, who provided some of these ideas in the last 3 slides here about the UK NIHR. Professor Jardine's the head of the NHMRC Clinical Trials Centre in Australia. And she's very passionate about this idea that we need better infrastructure for clinical trials in Australia. So my conclusions are that it's really difficult to run clinical trials during this pandemic. That's certainly been our experience in Ascot. And as you've seen, I don't think we've been unique in that experience. And that partly relates to just how rapidly the science is moving. All these kind of results that have come out from overseas trials, whilst we've not been able to recruit, has meant that each question that we've been trying to address has been knocked down. And the question made sense when we started it, but obviously as we've moved along, the answers have been quickly found. And that relates also to the unpredictability of the numbers in the epidemiology in Australia. And we really haven't had the numbers of patients to be able to contribute a large amount to the global effort. Those 2 things, I think, were somewhat out of our control. What is somewhat in Australia's control is the lack of our underlying infrastructure to be able to rapidly mobilise clinical trials and recruitments, both from kind of site capacity, but also probably more central capacity, as well as the whole issue of governance approvals. And I think pandemic preparedness, and we hear that a lot, and that, you know, we think about vaccines, we think about the whole public health aspects, but that really should include a clinical trials infrastructure in Australia that allows us to be prepared and ready to be recruiting patients and answering important clinical questions. So I might stop there. Thanks, Jason.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Steve. We don't have any questions at the moment, and in the interest of trying to move along so that we can get through each of the speakers, I might thank you for your presentation.